Brubs. We're back with Dagny. Dagny, Juel. You gonna focus? Dagny, Juel, Przybyszewska. The Woman and the Myth. And we are on chapter 4. The Artist. The Artist. Chapter 4. The Artist. It is really a curse that if you've once started to write, it is impossible to stop. First comes one theme and then another, and so it continues. My books have not yet been published in Norwegian, otherwise I would have sent them to you a long time ago. Dagny to her friend Marguerite Ansorge, June 12th, 1899. I have no literary ambitions. Dagny to her publisher Arnost Prochaska, May 23rd, 1899. As myth, Dagny became superhuman, creator, and creation at one and the same time. As a woman, she wanted to be many things, but above all, perhaps, an artist. She studied the piano, she wrote, and she lived the life of the boheme. She dressed in slender black gowns with yellow sunflowers and long black boas. She wore her hair free and parted in the middle. She held court in the taverns, dancing, drinking, smoking, and talking with the men. Yet ultimately, only the costumes and the company came easily to her. The power she wielded as a mythic presence was crossed by the powerlessness she experienced as a woman attempting to express herself through her music and her writing. Hers was still a 19th century man's world, where myth was one thing, reality another. Her efforts to function as an artist in her own right reveal the tragic failure of the myth to translate into life. What do you got? Alfred Wysocki remembered visiting Dagny and Stosh one night in Berlin. I've always liked music, and after dinner I asked Dagny to play. She resisted for the longest time, but finally gave in. I noticed later that Przybyszewska was jealous of his wife's music. Actually, they spelled it wrong, I believe. Of his wife's music, which clearly brought back uncomfortable memories to him. I'm not playing any game. There's a game. Boom. How did that feel? There's your game. You lose. When later at my urging, she began to play a piece by Chopin, she didn't get farther than a few bars when Stashu said something to her in Norwegian. She got up at once, sat down in the sofa next to me, and explained that Stash himself would play Chopin. Wysocki's story of Dagny being silenced by Stash when she began to play his Chopin might be the metaphor for her struggle to compete in a world where men considered art their territory and women only hesitantly dared to challenge them. Stash's piano playing, for example, was a very public phenomenon and greatly praised. Munch's remembrance of him from the Schwarzviertel days was typical. I still see him as he sat there in the corner of the sofa of that little wine house in Berlin, slouched and with feverish eyes, talking hoarsely and slowly as if he was giving a monologue about himself. Then he could suddenly jump up in ecstasy and run over to the piano so fast that he seemed to be following an inner voice calling to him. And in the deadly quiet following the first chord, Chopin's immortal music sounded through the narrow room and suddenly changed it to a radiant concert hall, to a concert hall of art. Even the people of Kongsvinger were treated to Stasha's musical talents, though they seem to have responded to him with more reserve than his Ferkel friends. A short notice in the local newspaper in December 1895 read, Przybyszewska's concert in the gymnastics hall on Sunday attracted a relatively good house, and the concert holder reaped well-deserved applause for his fine, quick, and well-executed performance. Dagny's piano playing remained private. She played for her family and her friends. She gave piano lessons to earn money both in Berlin and when she came home to Raleigh. Once in 1894 she went, or at least was planning to go, on a local concert tour in the Kongsvinger environs with her sister Ragnhild and a friend. The only notice, however, was in Ragnhild's letter to her husband Helge. Actually, we're going out on a tour. Lubin and Dagny have asked me to do it for so long that I really can't say no. And naturally, it will be fun and good to earn some money too. It will be a tour of 14 days at the most, and we're leaving sometime next week. Playing Chopin. Dagny achieved greater success as a writer than as a musician, but she struggled equally in that role to play Chopin. By the time she died, 3 of her plays had been published. The Stronger in her native Norwegian, When the Sun Goes Down, and Synden, the Sin in Polish, and the last also in Czech. And her prose poem cycle, Sing mir das Lied vom Leben und vom Tod, first in Polish and then in Norwegian. Her death in 1901 shocked the public, and in Poland aroused the public's interest in her works. In Norway, people took note of her scandalous death but paid no further attention to her writing until the 1970s, when there was increasing interest in women authors of the past. Her cycle of lyric poems, Digged Poems, was published in 1975. The short story Rediviva in 1977, and a collection of 3 plays, Synden Og to Andre Skuespil, The Sin, and 2 other plays in 1978. The first known mention of her as a writer was made by Bengt Lidfors in a letter to Strindberg dated February 6, 1894. Juel has now chosen her occupation and seized the pen instead of the prick. Okay, she's writing short stories about love, whoring, murder, and other depravities. And the saddest thing of all, Poland, Przybyszewska says it's good, but deeper in animal baseness one can hardly sink, and then the only resort is to retreat upward or die in the muck. Lidfors confided that Dagny had promised to show him her manuscript. He wondered if Strindberg would like to see it. Connecting Dagny to whoring was a tactic consistently used against her by the men she provoked. In retrospect, it was the perfect strategy for limiting her power. She challenged these men on sacred battleground, threatening the primacy of their closely guarded creative and sexual authority. 2 of the men most captivated by Dagny and 2 of the most sorely wounded were Lidfors and Strindberg, who conducted what can best be described as a hate campaign against her in their personal correspondence of 1893 to 1894. As Strindberg's friend Adolf Paul wrote, he hated her like sin, all the while he must have loved her. Hello, brovs. Dagny could only have added insult to injury when she decided to take up the pen herself. That there existed in the 19th century a near literal connection in men's and women's minds between creativity, and male potency has been convincingly demonstrated by, among others, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar in The Mad Woman in the Attic, 1979. Is that one book that I got? That'd be crazy. No, it's Carolyn Gordon. Male sexuality is not just analogically, but actually the essence of literary power. The poet's pen is, in some sense, even more than figuratively a penis. Gilbert and Gubar contended that literary authority, like sexual authority, was considered so exclusively male that any woman who attempted to achieve it was considered not only intrusive, but absolutely unredeemable. No virtue can outweigh the fault of her presumption because she has grotesquely crossed boundaries dictated by nature. Banked lid force proved their point as well as anyone could with his insinuation that Dagny, like an animal, would be dying in the muck, all because she decided to try her hand at writing. Lidforce was less incensed, though still exceedingly condescending of the fact that Dagny had also started writing her memoirs. She mustered up her courage and read the beginning to me. He conceded that her style was sincere. It really seems to be written straight from the heart, simple and unaffected. The poor devil loves her statue absolutely incurably, it seems. Lidforce must have considered memoir writing a more appropriate literary activity for a woman than short stories about love, infidelity, and murder. Apparently depraved subject in his mind, unless we must suppose in the hands of men. For what could he have thought his friend Strindberg wrote about? Unfortunately, Dagny's memoirs have not survived. It is quite apparent from Lidforce's letter that he was agitated not only because Dagny had literary ambitions, but because she had literary connections as well. He referred to his translation of an article by Strindberg on immortality, which he had submitted to the editor of Freya Bune, Otto Julius Beerbaum. Lidforce attributed Beerbaum's lack of interest to Dagny's influence with him, though Lidforce's method was once again to ridicule her rather than to acknowledge her power. He suggested that she had not understood the meaning of the article. Lidforce's letter indicates the prejudices Dagny faced and the ways they were made manifest. All right, brubs. Lidforce's letter indicates the prejudices. Lidforce's letter indicates the prejudices Dagny faced and the ways. He suggested that she had not understood the meaning of the article. I don't know where I left off. Lidforce's letter indicates the prejudices Dagny faced and the way they were made manifest. She was open, trusting, and anxious for a response. He reacted with duplicity and ridicule, directed in this particular letter not only toward her, but toward Stash, who encouraged her in her ambitions. Lidforce appealed too to the mutual fears of his colleague Strindberg, solidifying the bond of this brotherhood, whose main aim was to assure each other that Juel was no good. On the other hand, at least at this time, Dagny seems to have had Stash's support. He was the spiritual force of the Schwarz-Ferkel group and the man whose opinion must have mattered the most to her. He obviously encouraged her privately. He boasted of her writing publicly to their friends and on occasion to his parents. His backing of her writing also took a more active form. In December 1897, he wrote to Arnost Prochaska, editor of Moderny Review in Prague, asking him to publish 3 of her plays. I have a very big favor to ask you. My wife has written 3 little plays, fully perfected in their way. I speak not as a husband, but as an artist. He negotiated with Prochaska for publication of The Sin. It was also undoubtedly through his influence that Dagny's works were published in Poland, initially all of them in Zaisi. Supportive though he may have been, however, Stash primarily thought of his wife as the force behind his own pen, not the wielder of her own. In the preface dedication to the posthumously published collection, When the Sun Goes Down, he presumed to be passing on Dagny's legacy rather than she, as the author of her own works. To my children, Xenon and Iwi, I pass on your mother's legacy, he wrote. He left no doubt that it was in reference to himself and his creativity that her significance lay. She grew up in wealth and luxury. For a dozen years, she was given the opportunity to test herself on need and difficulty because she shared her life with an artist who had to fight to survive. A highly cultured woman with an unusual and artistic intuition, intimate with my unexpressed creative intentions, the one person who knew the entire depths of my creative power, and who lured from my soul what was still unconscious to me. That was your mother. In Stasha's eyes, there was only one artist. Dagny's role, he made clear, was as his muse, not his equal. Much earlier, during their first year together, he had written to Adolf Paul about Dagny's unusual inspirational powers. If the pen is the supreme metaphor for male literary creativity and authority, his choice of metaphor for her genius is the pen's opposite, a force without form and whose meaning is derived from its service to his creator's soul. Much in my soul was written with invisible ink. It only needed heat to be visible. Dagny seemed to vacillate between knowing she could be and knowing she was not as creative as Stash and their artist friends. She was deeply ambivalent about writing. Though she wrote throughout her adult life, she did not seem to know whether to admit to having literary ambitions or not. The first mention she made of her writing in the correspondence that has survived was in a letter from Berlin to her sister Ragnhild around the new year, 1896 to 97. She said that her play, The Stronger, was going to be published in the Norwegian journal Samtiden. Her reaction was a mixture of excitement and surprise, for she had not submitted the play for publication herself. Think, my little drama, The Stronger is appearing in the next issue of Samtiden. Do you get Samtiden? I suddenly got a letter from Aunt Birgit, who apparently has shown it to Gerhard Gran. It was a complete surprise to me. It wouldn't even have occurred to me to send it out. Dagny's surprise that her play should be taken at all seriously is curious, for she had submitted it to the Christiana Theater in January, a year earlier. She may, however, have submitted it more in the hope that it would bring money than artistic recognition. She and Stash were in Copenhagen and trying to get to Berlin. For lack of money, she returned to Raleigh for several months. The theater's rejection of her play may have convinced her not to take it seriously herself. But then her very choice of a title is again curious. Surely she knew that Strindberg had written his one-act play of the same name in 1888 and 89. Was her own play meant as a challenge to him, at the same time as she could only think of it as her little drama? She did not grow less ambivalent over the years, though she enjoyed some success. In 1898, The Sin was published in the Czech literary journal Modern Review, as well as in the journal's book series. The prose poem cycle Sing mir das Lied vom Leben und vom Tod was published in Zaisi in 1899. In June of that year, Dagny wrote to Marguerite Ansors saying that she wished she could send her her books and also that she was working on a new play. Writing seemed to preoccupy her. She called it a curse. First comes one theme, then another, and so it continues. Yet, just 3 weeks earlier, she had written to her Czech publisher, Przybyszewska, first my heartfelt thanks for the nice remuneration for my dramas, which pleased me greatly, but even more for the friendly words which you once wrote about them in a letter to my husband. I have no literary ambitions, but I place high value on your judgment, and I know that you say only what you mean. Dagny was far more assertive as a cultural agent on others' behalf. She was, of course, one of the driving influences behind Pan, the exquisite, short lived Art Nouveau journal that featured the works of the most progressive artists of the time, among others Arnold Backlund, Richard, or is it Ricard Demel, Arne Garborg, J.K. Huysmans, Thomas Kittelson, Max Klinger, Maurice Maeterlinck, Friedrich Nietzsche, Novalis, Sigbjorn Obstfelder, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Paul Verlaine, Gustav Vigeland, and James Whistler. Dagny translated Stasha's novel Unterwegs on the way from German to Norwegian. Obstfelder's short story Live from Norwegian to German for the fall issue of Pan 1895, and Carl Gustav Tvastjärna's novel I've Forabund Med Döden in League with Death from Swedish to Norwegian 1894 in connection with Tvastjärna's book Ragnhild inadvertently captured a picture of Dagny working intensely in the service of others versus Stash working intensely for himself. She wrote to Helge from Raleigh, Statue is fantastic, is almost finished with the 300-page long novel and has many irons in the fire. Dagny is also overcome with colossal diligence and is right now working on the last chapter of Tvastjärna's newest book, so I think things are beginning to brighten for them. June 13th, 1894. Dagny took a particular interest in the work of her friend Munch. During her last spring in Warsaw, she was trying to arrange an exhibit for him for the coming fall and to negotiate the sale of his works. In her two last letters to him from this time, there is almost no hint of the tragedy unfolding in her own life, only the following melancholy note. Things are going well for us at the moment, insofar as Statue is the world's most famous poet in Poland right now, and beginning to earn a little money. In Germany, his books are in their second printing, but actually, we are rather sad people. Things were better in Louisienstrasse. As a matter of fact, if you came, we would drink schnapps and smoke cigarettes and have fun. In relationship to Stash, Dagny seemed not only to accept with enthusiasm, but to indulge in her secondary role as his editor, agent, translator, muse, and handmaiden. She was always fiercely loyal to him as an artist. Even during the last months in Warsaw, when they were so estranged, she had publicly chided the newspaper journalists for criticizing Stasha's ideas, curtsying to him on the street, and mock appreciation of his attack on Przybyszewskism. Several weeks later, her life falling to pieces, she was trying to convince Stash to change publishers. He was in Lemberg preparing one of his plays for production, and Jadwiga Kasprowitz was with him. Dagny was alone with her son in Warsaw. In a letter taken up completely with Stash's professional future, she wrote, at a time when her own future was as precarious as it had ever been. First, send me immediately an original manuscript. You understand, manuscript, not printed, of Stoli Runo. Szewski has influence. He knows the conditions, and he is your honest friend. His wife is sweet, smart, pretty. Now, further, Fisher is an absolute known swindler, and Szewski says that the prices he paid you are miserable. Geben, Gebenther, Gebenther, I don't know how to say it, Gebenther and Wolf want positively to take you completely into their hands. Please, Stasio, do it right away, and you will not regret it. And then, Stasio, come back to Warsaw soon. You are absolutely needed here. It is infinitely sad and gloomy here, and it is snowing and terribly cold. Sad, too sad. And why do you never write when you will return? Dagny had long gone to considerable lengths to help Stosh get publishers. In the summer of 1894, for example, when they were both home in Norway, she tried to use her influence with Lars M. Swanström, head of the Christiana branch of Gildendal Publishers. In an effort to convince him to publish a new book by Stosh, she had shown him a private letter from the Norwegian writer Arne Garborg. Garborg had written in praise of Stosh's earlier novel, On the Way, which Dagny had translated. To her embarrassment, Swanström printed the letter in the newspaper, Verdens Gang. She immediately sent an apology to Garborg. It is partly my fault and partly a misunderstanding on Mr. Svanström's sick part. I gave him an indefinite yes when he asked my permission to do it. I did it mostly out of irritation because Svanström could not accept the new book by my husband because not a word is being written about this one. But right away the next morning, I saw how tactless it was to misuse a private letter in that way, and went down to S to get the letter back. I got the letter but didn't see Svanström, and I see from Verdens Gang today that I was too late anyway. My husband is terribly upset and asks me to convey his apology to you. No, I'm not a 5-year-old. A year later, in the late summer of 1895, Dagny was prepared to jeopardize her own health and the health of her unborn child to bolster Stosh's impoverished literary career and their impoverished circumstances. More than 8 months pregnant and at home at Raleigh, she was planning to go to Copenhagen to search for a publisher. Ragnhild, who was also home at the time, wrote to her husband, Helge, Dagny and Stosh are so desperate again, they're completely crazy, and it's terrible to watch. Aunt Henrika must absolutely have her money back, and they don't see any solution at all. So Dagny has this mad plan to travel to Copenhagen to look for a publisher, but that is insanity for her now. Dagny's sisters protected her by devising a complicated plan to lend her money while concealing the source. Dagny may certainly have always had an ulterior monetary motive in attempting to secure publishers for Stosh, and she may also have gained a modicum of control over him as his professional advisor. But there was also something obsessive and self-destructive about her dedication to him. Iwa Kosik often portrayed her as a woman who built an altar to Stosh and his art, painting a picture, for example, of masochistic devotions in the wake of Marta Forder's suicide. Kosik pointed out that it was at this time that Stosh wrote the long poem Am Mir by the Sea, which later, during the time in Krakow, was dedicated to my wife and illustrated with the fantastic portrait Wyspiansky drew of Dagny. It is the tale of a white slave from the north, captured by the king of the south, who loves her so much that he becomes her slave. Kosik did not know that Dagny, too, was writing poetry at this time. Poetry that reveals a woman so alienated from her world and herself that she exists only in scattered bits of body and soul. In a prose poem, probably written sometime later, Dagny, in fact, told of a woman who loses her soul when she builds a spiritual altar to the man who had loved her. Then she genuflected in memory of him, in memory of his great love. She built a temple to him in her heart. And all her dreams, her pain, her longing, she let billow like frankincense around his portrait. Sing mir das Lied vom Leben und vom Tod. So aware as a writer that such self annihilating devotion was a danger, Dagny seemed nevertheless to court it in her relationship to Stash as a man and as an artist. Their good friend from Krakow, Boy Zelensky, remembered that she was interested in every detail of Stash's career, every novel, every poem, every article he wrote. Since she did not read Polish well, she insisted that everything be translated for her. Boy Zelensky remembered, too, that when Stash was writing, Dagny kept their house as silent as a church. When he finished, she let it fill up with laughter. Stash accepted her devotion as his due. Although Dagny enjoyed near mythic status among her contemporaries, historical and psychological factors mitigated against her, assuming that she was an artist on equal footing with those she inspired and helped. She had no permanent home, little money, and little peace of mind. She was torn between her many roles as artist, wife, mother, daughter, sister, celebrity, and muse. Her marriage to Stash, fulfilling as it may have been at times, was marked by separations, scandals, and betrayals. As a writer, she received little encouragement, succeeded in getting very few things published, was ridiculed, at least by some, for her literary presumptions, and ignored by most as a creative person in her own right. Stash, her greatest support, was a narcissist who could conceive of only one artist, himself. Yet Dagny also had an unnamed demon that waged war from within. It was the part of her that rushed to submit to Stash's emotional tyranny, the part of her Iwakasik called her somnambulant psyche, the part of her that preferred to drift in spooky silence, and the part of her we are unable to reconstruct. If we compare Dagny to her younger and favorite sister Ragnhild, we must suspect that she lacked some inner conviction that would have allowed her to assert herself more aggressively as an artist. Ragnhild was nearly 5 years younger than Dagny. As early as her teens, she had decided to become an opera singer, studying initially in Christiana with Erika Nielsen, the Norwegian pianist of European fame. At the age of 20, she went to Paris to study, first for several months in the winter of 1891 to 2, then again the following October for a period of 8 months. Both Ragnhild and Dagny became secretly engaged in the spring of 1893. Ragnhild, only 22 years old, suffered deep conflict about giving up her singing career. Prior to her marriage in November 1893, she went on tour with Nissen, or is it Nissen, down the west coast of Norway, and in Bergen she sang for Edvard Grieg. Her letters to her fiancé, Helge Backstrom, reveal both anger and anguish at the possibility of giving up her artistic aspirations. She did finally choose marriage and motherhood, but she had shown a conscious determination to be an artist that Dagny had not. When Munch painted the early portrait of Dagny and Ragnhild, two music-making sisters, he had Dagny sitting at the piano with her back solidly to the viewer and Ragnhild standing at her side, face forward and upright. And there it is. Perhaps Munch understood something already then about that part of Dagny that simply turned away from life. It was, of course, Dagny and not Ragnhild who remained the artist, but had Dagny had her sister's inner conviction, she might have become a greater writer, even in the face of the severe limitations her times and circumstances placed upon her. Dagny seems, in fact, to have used Ragnhild as the inspiration for one of her prose poems, in which a woman painfully strives to create. She stands at the piano and sings. He sits leisurely back and listens. She stands and sings, inward tuned, turned, drowning in this one single feeling that lifts her soul into the clouds, into the sun. Time and space fade into a dawning mist. Past and present meet in a bluing crest, and the melody lifts its bleeding wings and flutters enwrapped into space, searching, searching, and turning back with a sigh. And again it raises its wide wings, and light as sundust flies up to the stars and sits among them, itself a star. And now the melody lifts its broad wings and majestically sails out over the wide, wide sea, over high hills and mountain crests. Higher, higher, reeling, oblivious. Ah, it's flying into the sun. Et la tristesse de tout, or is that tout? Sila mon ami. Black Mirrors. Dagny wrote too little to have become a major writer of her time, yet her plays and poems are at once links in the literary chain of the 1890s and dark mirrors into the heart of the very intelligent, very conflicted, and ever so silent woman. She wrote quintessentially fin de siecle. Oh, not that word again. I still haven't looked it up. Fin de siecle? Seek? I don't know how to say it. Works, exotic literary flowers that seem to grow from the darkness of the heart. A spiritual sister of Baudelaire, Verlaine, or is it Verlaine? Verlaine, Knut Hamsun, Sigbjorn Opsfeller, Ola Hansen, Strindberg, and Przybyszewska. She was haunted by the moods of the soul and dreamed of conjuring forth its secret truths. She was experimental, searching for the perfect form and the perfect language, be it in the prose poem and lyric poetry or in the anti-naturalist drama. In order to convey the very essence of a mood, she pared her language down to a minimum, heightened her imagery, and developed a supremely sensitive, self-absorbed, poetic persona. When she looked into the anxious soul of the persona, she saw longings for inner harmony transformed into pathological obsessions with love, beauty, erotic power, fate, and death. Dagny's writing is daring in its themes, its imagery, and its techniques. Her heroines make bold, if often criminal, choices. They cross sacred boundaries and they accept the tragic consequences. Her landscapes are gothic, full of dead spirits, rare flowers, cold, dark tombs, and bloody rivers. Her techniques are expressionistic, designed to project the dark, internal world into the light. Yet her bold style is made to serve far more fragile feelings, all of them manifestations of anxiety. The myth of womanhood she inspired suggested a world of unlimited promises and possibilities, changing definitions and new modes of behavior. As a writer, she was preoccupied with the underbelly of the myth. She wrote about the near madness suffered by a woman trapped between one identity and another, one world and another, one lifetime and another. The myth celebrated the integration of the intellectual, the spiritual, and the sensual in one woman. Her works probed the schizophrenia experienced by a woman who seeks to know and be herself in all her glory, human, demonic, and divine. The myth suggested that there were no limitations. Her works are like prisons from which she cannot escape. The myth promised freedom. The writer revealed a world in which she could barely breathe. The striking, unsettling similarity between the women of the myth and the women of the works is that they are both utterly alone. They are backsides of each other. The one dancing self possessed in the phosphorescent light, the other fleeing through dark landscapes in search of herself. Dagny's poems and plays are like the black mirrors used by the artists of the 19th century to read the mystery of their own image. The blackness, the longer one gazes into it, ceases to be black but becomes a queer silver blue, the threshold to secret visions. They are indeed the legacy she left of who she was and what she saw. Hers was a frightening world. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 next time.